My name is Robert, but most folks in my small Tennessee town just called me Brother Thompson for the better part of 30 years. I'm 73 years old now, and if you're watching this video, it's because something inside me finally broke open after decades of keeping quiet about the most devastating mistake of my life. You see, I wasn't just any member of the Jehovah's Witnesses. I was an elder, a man who other people looked up to for spiritual guidance, someone who was supposed to have all the answers about God's will and righteousness. But I'm here today to tell you about how following those answers, following that organization's rules without question, cost me something I can never get back: the chance to know my grandson before he died at just 11 years old. I wasn't born into this faith like so many others. No, I came to it as a grown man of 28, searching for meaning after coming back from Vietnam in 1971. The war had left me hollow inside, questioning everything I thought I knew about life and death, and whether there was any real purpose to any of it. My wife, Margaret, and I had been married for 3 years, struggling to make sense of a world that seemed to be falling apart around us. The protests, the violence, the uncertainty, everything felt unstable except for the small apartment we shared in Maryville, where Margaret worked as a secretary at the local bank, and I tried to find steady work with my hands, fixing things that other people had broken. That's when Brother Williams and Brother Davis knocked on our door on a Saturday morning in March. I remember it was unseasonably warm for early spring, and Margaret had just finished hanging laundry on the line behind our little rental house. These two men stood there in their neat suits, carrying briefcases and wearing the kind of confident smiles that suggested they had answers to questions I didn't even know I was asking. "Good morning, sir," Brother Williams said, extending his hand with a firm grip that reminded me of the certainty I'd been missing since coming home. "We're here today to share some wonderful news about God's kingdom and the paradise that's coming soon to this earth." Most people would have politely declined and closed the door, but something about their absolute conviction drew me in. Maybe it was the way they spoke about the Bible, like it was a roadmap with clear directions. Or maybe it was just that I was desperate for something to believe in that made sense of all the chaos I'd witnessed. They showed me pictures in their literature, images of families living in perfect harmony, lions lying down with lambs, children playing safely in a world without war or suffering. After what I'd seen in the jungles of Southeast Asia, where boys barely out of high school were dying for reasons nobody could adequately explain, the promise of a peaceful earth under God's kingdom felt like exactly what my soul needed to hear. Margaret was skeptical at first, but she could see how much these weekly Bible studies meant to me. Brother Williams would come every Tuesday evening, and we'd sit at our kitchen table going through their publications page by page, verse by verse. The Watchtower magazine, the Awake magazine, books with titles like The Truth Shall Make You Free and Life Everlasting in Freedom of the Sons of God. Every piece of literature reinforced the same central message. Jehovah's Witnesses were the only true Christians on earth, the only organization that God was using to prepare people for survival through Armageddon, and anyone who wanted to live forever in paradise had to be part of this exclusive group. The structure appealed to me after the chaos of civilian life following military service. There were clear rules about everything: how to dress, how to behave, what kind of entertainment was appropriate, even what kind of career goals were acceptable. Pioneering, which meant spending at least 90 hours a month going door-to-door preaching, was presented as the highest form of service to God. Getting married and having children was fine, but the emphasis was always on putting the organization's work first, because the end of this system of things was so close that planning for a future in this world was almost considered a lack of faith. Within 6 months, both Margaret and I were attending all the meetings at the Kingdom Hall 3 times a week without fail. The Watchtower study on Sunday mornings, the Theocratic Ministry School on Thursday evenings, and the service meeting that followed. Every gathering reinforced the same themes. The world was controlled by Satan. Persecution of God's people was to be expected, and absolute loyalty to the organization was the same as loyalty to Jehovah himself. Anyone who questioned the teachings or raised doubts was labeled as spiritually weak or, worse, as being influenced by apostate thinking. I threw myself into this new life with the same intensity I'd once applied to surviving in combat. By 1973, I was baptized as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, fully convinced that I had found the truth that would guide me for the rest of my life. Margaret followed a few months later, though I could sometimes catch her staring out the window during meetings with a distant look that suggested her heart wasn't quite as committed as mine. But I was on fire with certainty, spending every spare moment studying the organization's literature, preparing for meetings, and going door to door in the rural communities around our town. The brothers recognized my dedication quickly. Within 2 years, I was appointed as a ministerial servant, helping with the practical aspects of running the Kingdom Hall, organizing the literature, maintaining the building, assisting with the sound system during meetings. The elders would take me aside after meetings to commend my progress and suggest that I might be ready for even greater responsibilities in God's organization. This kind of recognition felt like the approval and purpose I'd been searching for since coming home from the war, and I embraced every opportunity to prove my faithfulness. In 1976, when I was 33 years old, I received the appointment that would define the next chapter of my life. I became an elder in the Maryville Kingdom Hall congregation. The responsibility was enormous, and the honor even greater, according to everything I'd been taught. Elders were considered as gifts from God to the congregation, men who were supposed to shepherd the flock with wisdom and compassion while maintaining strict adherence to the organization's standards. We handled judicial matters, counseled families in crisis, and served as the local representatives of the Watchtower Society's authority. Margaret and I had been trying to start a family for several years, and in 1977, our prayers were answered when she gave birth to our daughter Sarah. Holding that tiny girl in my arms for the first time, I felt a love so overwhelming that it seemed to confirm everything I believed about God's goodness and his plan for our lives. Sarah would grow up in the truth, I told myself, surrounded by the love and protection of God's organization, prepared from birth to serve Jehovah faithfully and inherit eternal life in the paradise that was surely just around the corner. As Sarah grew from a baby into a bright, curious toddler, I made sure that everything in our home reflected our dedication to the truth. We had family worship every Monday evening, going through the organization's publications designed for children, teaching her simple songs about Jehovah and paradise, and explaining why our family was different from the neighbors who celebrated birthdays and Christmas. Sarah's first words included Jehovah and paradise, and I felt proud that we were raising her to love God's name and look forward to the new world that was coming soon. The congregation became our entire social world. Every friend we had was a fellow witness. Every social activity revolved around theocratic interests, and every major decision in our lives was filtered through the lens of what the organization taught was God's will. When other families in our neighborhood would have barbecues or birthday parties, we would politely decline and instead spend our time with brothers and sisters from the Kingdom Hall, always reinforcing the message that we were separate from the world and its corrupt influences. By the time Sarah turned 5, she was already showing signs of the intelligence and independent thinking that would eventually become both a blessing and what the organization would call a curse. She asked questions during our family worship sessions that sometimes caught me off guard. Questions like why God would destroy good people who weren't Jehovah's Witnesses, or why we couldn't celebrate her friend's birthday party if it would make the little girl happy. I would give her the standard answers I'd been taught. God's ways are higher than our ways. We show love by following his commandments even when we don't fully understand them. And the world's celebrations are based on pagan origins that displease Jehovah. As Sarah grew older and started attending the Kingdom Hall meetings regularly, she became known in our congregation for her thoughtful comments during the Watchtower studies. The other elders would often compliment Margaret and me on how well we were raising our daughter in the truth, and I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that my child was being recognized as a spiritual example for other young people in the congregation. She was baptized at 15, which was considered quite young and therefore especially commendable, showing her eagerness to dedicate her life to Jehovah's service. But underneath that outward conformity, I began to notice small signs that Sarah was struggling with some of the organization's teachings. She would sometimes come home from school with questions about evolution that her science teachers had raised, or she would ask why certain movies and books were forbidden when they seemed to contain positive messages about friendship and courage. I would patiently explain the dangers of independent thinking and the importance of trusting the faithful and discreet slave class, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, to interpret God's will for us. When Sarah turned 18 in 1995, she made a decision that surprised both Margaret and me. Instead of becoming a pioneer missionary as we had hoped, she announced that she wanted to attend the local community college to study nursing. The elders had always taught that pursuing higher education was discouraged because it took time and energy away from spiritual activities, and because the end of this system was so close that career preparation was essentially unnecessary. But Sarah argued that becoming a nurse would allow her to help people and that medical skills might even be useful in the new world after Armageddon. Margaret and I discussed this privately for weeks, torn between wanting to support our daughter's apparent desire to help others and following the organization's clear guidance about the dangers of higher education. The elders counseled us that allowing Sarah to attend college could expose her to apostate thinking and worldly influences that might weaken her faith. But Sarah was determined, and she had saved money from part-time work to pay for her classes. Against our better judgment and after much prayer, we decided to allow her to enroll, hoping that her strong foundation in the truth would protect her from any negative influences she might encounter. The changes in Sarah began gradually during her first semester at college. She would come home from classes with new ideas about science and human psychology that sometimes conflicted with what the Watchtower taught about human nature and God's creation. When I would try to correct her thinking using the organization's publications, she would ask to see the original sources that the Watchtower was quoting, or she would point out that some of the scientific claims in our literature were outdated or inaccurate. During her second year of nursing school, Sarah began missing some of the midweek meetings, claiming that her clinical rotations at the hospital required her to work evening shifts. Margaret and I were concerned, but we told ourselves that her nursing training was temporary and that once she graduated, she would return to full participation in congregation activities. The elders were less understanding, and they began making comments during their visits to our home about the importance of not allowing worldly careers to interfere with spiritual priorities. It was during Sarah's final year of nursing school that she met David, a young man who was also studying to become a registered nurse. David wasn't one of Jehovah's Witnesses, he was what we called a worldly person. But according to Sarah, he was kind, intelligent, and shared her passion for helping sick people. When she first mentioned him during dinner one evening, I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. I knew from experience as an elder that romantic relationships with non-witnesses almost always led to spiritual disaster for the believing partner. Margaret and I immediately arranged for a meeting with the other elders to discuss how to handle Sarah's situation. The conclusion was unanimous. Sarah needed to end her relationship with David immediately, or she would face serious spiritual consequences. When we sat her down to explain this, her reaction was unlike anything I had ever seen from my daughter. Instead of the respectful submission I expected, Sarah became angry and defensive. "He's a better Christian than half the people in our congregation," she said, her voice rising in a way that shocked me. "He volunteers at homeless shelters. He's never pressured me to do anything against my beliefs, and he treats me with more respect than some of the brothers who think women should just sit quietly and agree with everything men tell them. The conversation escalated into the worst argument Margaret and I had ever had with our daughter. Sarah accused us of being controlling and narrow-minded, while I tried to explain that God's standards weren't negotiable and that her eternal life was at stake. The discussion ended with Sarah storming out of the house, saying she needed time to think about what she really believed versus what she had been told to believe. For 3 weeks, Sarah stayed with a friend from nursing school, and Margaret cried herself to sleep every night. I spent hours in prayer and Bible study, searching for wisdom about how to handle this crisis. The other elders advised me that if Sarah chose to marry David, she would be considered as good as disfellowshipped, even if no formal action was taken. They reminded me that as an elder, I had a responsibility to set an example for the congregation by not compromising with worldly thinking, even when it involved my own family. When Sarah finally came home, she had made her decision. She was going to marry David in a small civil ceremony, and while she still believed in God, she could no longer accept that the Watchtower organization was his exclusive channel of communication with humanity. She had been researching the history of Jehovah's Witnesses online and had discovered what she called disturbing patterns of failed predictions, doctrinal changes, and policies that seemed more focused on protecting the organization's reputation than helping people. The night before Sarah's wedding in 1999, I made the most difficult decision of my life up to that point. Following the guidance I had received from the other elders and from the organization's publications about maintaining spiritual purity, I told my 22-year-old daughter that if she went through with marrying David, our family would have no choice but to cut off all contact with her. This wasn't personal hatred, I explained through my tears, but obedience to God's command to not associate with those who rejected his organization. Sarah looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak that I can still see clearly in my mind today, 25 years later. "Dad," she said quietly, "you're choosing an organization over your own daughter. Can't you see how wrong that is?" But I couldn't see it then. I was convinced that I was making the righteous choice, the painful but necessary decision that would somehow demonstrate my love for Jehovah and might even shock Sarah into returning to the truth. The organization had taught me that sometimes we had to be cruel to be kind, that cutting off family members who left the faith was actually a loving provision from God designed to help them realize their mistake and come back. Sarah married David on a Saturday afternoon in June 1999, and neither Margaret nor I attended the ceremony. Instead, we spent that day at the Circuit Assembly, listening to talks about the importance of loyalty to God's organization and the blessings that come from putting kingdom interests ahead of family ties. When we returned home that evening, Sarah had come by the house to collect the rest of her belongings. She left a note on the kitchen table that simply said, "I love you both, and I hope someday you'll understand that love shouldn't have conditions." You know what, my dear friends who are listening to this old man's story? I want to pause here for just a moment and say something from my heart. If you've made it this far in my story, it means you're the kind of person who understands that sometimes the most important truths come wrapped in pain. I see some of you nodding along because maybe you've lived through something similar, or maybe you're watching this late at night when you can't sleep because your own heart is carrying burdens that feel too heavy to share with anyone else. I want you to know that your story matters too. Whatever brought you to this video tonight, whatever questions you're asking or pain you're carrying, you're not alone in this world. Sometimes it takes an old fool like me telling his worst mistakes for other people to find the courage to face their own difficult truths. So please, if this story is touching something in your heart, let me know in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what's on your mind. I read every single comment, and I promise you that whatever you're going through, There's someone else out there who understands. The silence that followed Sarah's departure from our lives was deafening in ways I never could have anticipated. Margaret and I went through the motions of our daily routines, but our house felt like a tomb where laughter used to live. Every morning I would wake up and for just a split second forget what had happened, and then the reality would crash over me again like a wave of cold water. My daughter was gone, not because she had died, but because I had chosen to make her dead to us in obedience to what I believed were God's commands. The other elders in the congregation were supportive of our decision, constantly reminding me that we had done the right thing and that Jehovah would bless our faithfulness. Brother Thompson, Elder Martinez would say after meetings, "Your example of putting God's organization first is strengthening the entire congregation. Some of the younger brothers are learning from watching how you've handled this difficult situation. Their approval should have comforted me, but instead it felt hollow, like praise for winning a contest that nobody should have entered in the first place." Margaret struggled more than I did with the shunning arrangement, though she tried to hide her pain out of loyalty to me and to the organization. I would catch her sometimes standing at Sarah's old bedroom window, staring out at nothing, and I knew she was wondering what our daughter was doing, whether she was happy, whether she ever thought about us. When I would try to comfort her with reminders about trusting in Jehovah's wisdom, Margaret would nod and smile, but her eyes remained empty in a way that worried me more than I was willing to admit. The months turned into years, and we learned to live with the absence of our only child, like people learn to live with a missing limb. You adapt, but you never stop feeling the phantom pain where something essential used to be. We threw ourselves deeper into congregation activities, as if increasing our service to the organization could somehow fill the void that Sarah's absence had created. I spent more time preparing for meetings, volunteered for additional responsibilities, and even began giving talks at circuit assemblies about the importance of maintaining spiritual purity even when it required difficult family decisions. In 2002, 3 years after Sarah's wedding, I heard through the informal network of gossip that exists in every small town that she and David had moved to Nashville, where they were both working at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. The person who told me this information, a neighbor who didn't know about our family situation, mentioned it casually while we were both getting our mail, as if it was normal news about normal people. But for me, it was like receiving a message from another world, a glimpse into a life that continued to exist, even though I had tried to pretend it didn't. Later that same year, Margaret came home from grocery shopping with a strange expression on her face. She sat down at our kitchen table and stared at her hands for a long time before she spoke. "Robert," she said finally, "I saw Sarah today at the supermarket." My heart stopped beating for what felt like several seconds. She was buying baby formula and diapers. Margaret paused, searching for the right words. She looked happy and tired, like new mothers look. The realization hit both of us at the same time, though neither of us said it out loud immediately. Sarah had a baby. We were grandparents. Somewhere in Nashville, there was a child who carried our blood, our genes, maybe even our smile or Margaret's laugh, and we would never know him. The organization's shunning policy meant that we couldn't even send a card or a gift to acknowledge this grandchild's existence, because any contact whatsoever with a disfellowshipped family member was considered a form of rebellion against God's arrangement. I tried to convince myself that learning about the baby didn't change anything, that our decision to shun Sarah was still the right one, and that maintaining our position would somehow benefit everyone involved in the long run. But late at night, when Margaret thought I was asleep, I could hear her crying quietly into her pillow, and I knew she was grieving not just for the daughter we had lost, but for the grandchild we would never know. Through the mysterious ways that information travels in small communities, we gradually learned more details about Sarah's new life. She had given birth to a son named Michael in the spring of 2002. David had been promoted to a supervisory position at the hospital, and Sarah was working part-time in pediatric nursing while caring for the baby. According to the people who occasionally shared this information with us, they seemed to be thriving as a young family, involved in their community and well-liked by their neighbors and co-workers. Each piece of information about Sarah and her family was like a small knife twisted in my heart. I wanted desperately to see pictures of my grandson, to know what he looked like, whether he had inherited the Thompson family chin or Margaret's green eyes. But accessing that information would require reaching out to Sarah, which the organization had made clear was absolutely forbidden. The Watchtower publications were filled with stories about faithful witnesses who had maintained their shunning of disfellowshipped family members for decades, and these stories were always presented as examples of admirable loyalty to God's standards. In 2004, when Michael would have been about 2 years old, I made a decision that I convinced myself was justifiable within the organization's rules. I drove to Nashville on a Saturday afternoon, telling Margaret that I had business to attend to in the city. I had learned through casual conversation where Sarah and David lived, and I parked across the street from their apartment complex, hoping to catch a glimpse of my grandson without actually making contact with my daughter. I sat in my car for 3 hours, feeling like both a private investigator and a criminal, watching the parking lot and playground area where children from the complex would play with their parents. Just as I was about to give up and drive home, I saw them. Sarah emerged from one of the buildings carrying a toddler with dark hair and chubby cheeks who was clearly excited about something he could see in the distance. She looked older than I remembered, more mature and confident, wearing casual clothes that suggested a life free from the constant scrutiny of congregation elders. The little boy, my grandson Michael, was pointing at something and chattering in the way that 2-year-olds do when they're discovering the world around them. Sarah laughed at whatever he was saying, and the sound of her laughter carried across the parking lot to where I sat hiding like a coward in my car. For just a moment, she looked directly in my direction, and I panicked, starting the engine and driving away as quickly as I could, terrified that she might recognize me and approach the car. The drive home was one of the longest of my life. I had seen my grandson, but the encounter left me feeling more empty than satisfied. He was beautiful and healthy and obviously loved, but he was also a stranger to me, and I was a stranger to him. If Sarah had seen me and approached the car, what would I have said? How could I have explained that I loved him but couldn't have a relationship with him because of religious rules that probably seemed insane to anyone outside our organization? That night, I confessed to Margaret what I had done, and instead of being angry with me for violating our shunning arrangement, she broke down and sobbed with a grief that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. "Robert," she said between her tears, "what kind of God would want grandparents to hide from their own grandchildren? What kind of love is this that requires us to act like our family doesn't exist?" Her questions disturbed me more than I wanted to admit, because they echoed doubts that I had been pushing down in my own heart for months. But I responded with the standard answers I had been trained to give. God's ways are higher than our ways. The organization knows better than we do what's best for everyone involved, and maintaining our integrity to Jehovah's standards would ultimately bring blessings to our entire family, including Sarah and Michael. The years continued to pass, and through the same informal channels, we learned that Michael was growing into an intelligent and active child. He had started kindergarten at a public school in Nashville, was learning to play soccer, and was apparently fascinated by books and science experiments. Sarah had returned to full-time nursing and was working in the children's cancer ward at Vanderbilt, while David had completed additional training to become a nurse practitioner specializing in emergency medicine. By 2008, when Michael was 6 years old, Margaret's health began to decline in ways that I now understand were directly related to the stress and depression of being separated from our family. She developed high blood pressure and chronic headaches, and her doctor recommended that she try to reduce the sources of stress in her life. When Margaret mentioned during one appointment that we hadn't spoken to our daughter in nearly a decade because of religious differences, the doctor looked confused and concerned, asking whether there might be ways to reconcile despite our disagreements. That conversation with Margaret's doctor was the first time I had heard someone outside our organization question the wisdom of our shunning policy. To everyone else in the world, the idea that religious beliefs would require parents to completely cut off contact with their children seemed not just unusual, but cruel and unnatural. But within the Kingdom Hall, our decision continued to be praised as an example of spiritual maturity and faithfulness to God's standards. In 2009, I learned through a chance encounter at the post office that Sarah and her family had moved back to our area. David had accepted a position at the regional medical center, and they had bought a house just 15 minutes away from where Margaret and I lived. The knowledge that my grandson was now living so close to us, possibly attending the same schools where Sarah had grown up, shopping in the same stores where we bought our groceries, was almost unbearable. Margaret began having what I can only describe as panic attacks whenever we went out in public, terrified that we might accidentally encounter Sarah and Michael and be forced to choose between acknowledging them or walking away. The organization's teachings were clear that even accidental encounters with disfellowshipped family members should be handled with the same coldness as intentional meetings. But the thought of having to ignore our own daughter and grandson in a public place filled both of us with dread. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October 2013, exactly 11 years and 4 months after I'd last spoken to my daughter. Margaret was at her weekly doctor's appointment, and I was sitting at our kitchen table reviewing notes for the upcoming elders' meeting when the telephone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Patricia Williams from the Children's Oncology Unit at Regional Medical Center, and her words hit me like a physical blow that knocked the air from my lungs. "Mr. Thompson," she said, with the practiced gentleness that medical professionals use when delivering devastating news, "I'm calling because your daughter Sarah listed you as her father on her son's emergency contact information. I need to inform you that 11-year-old Michael Thompson Martinez was admitted to our hospital yesterday evening with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and his condition is quite serious." The words seemed to echo in the empty kitchen while my mind struggled to process what I was hearing. My grandson, the child I had glimpsed only once from across a parking lot 9 years earlier, was dying of cancer. And somehow Sarah had still listed me as family, despite the years of silence and rejection. Dr. Williams continued talking about treatment protocols and the need for family support during difficult medical procedures. But all I could think about was the fact that Michael had been sick, possibly for weeks or months, and I had known nothing about it. When I managed to find my voice, I asked Dr. Williams whether Sarah knew that she had called me. "She specifically requested that we contact you," the doctor replied. "She said that despite your differences, you deserve to know what was happening with your grandson, and that Michael had been asking questions about his grandfather lately. The revelation that this child I had never met had been curious about me felt like a gift and a condemnation at the same time. I drove to the hospital in a state of emotional shock that made the familiar roads seem foreign and dreamlike. For 11 years, I had convinced myself that our shunning of Sarah was a temporary sacrifice that would eventually lead to her return to the organization and a happy reunion with our family. But now, I was being forced to confront the reality that this child, this innocent boy who had never done anything to deserve our abandonment, might die without ever really knowing that he had grandparents who loved him from a distance. The pediatric oncology ward at Regional Medical Center was a place I had never imagined visiting, filled with the kind of quiet desperation that hangs over families who are fighting battles they never expected to face. When I reached Michael's room, I stood in the doorway for several minutes, paralyzed by the sight of my grandson lying in a hospital bed connected to various machines and IV lines. He looked so small and fragile, but even with his head shaved from chemotherapy treatments, I could see the unmistakable resemblance to Sarah at that age. Sarah was sitting beside his bed, reading aloud from what appeared to be a science fiction novel. And when she noticed me standing in the doorway, her expressions cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope. "Hello, Dad," she said quietly, setting the book aside and standing up. "Thank you for coming." The simplicity of her greeting, free from anger or accusations, despite everything that had happened between us, made me realize how much wisdom and maturity she had gained during the years we had been apart. Michael looked up from his pillow with curious brown eyes that were clearly alert despite his illness. "Mom," he said in a voice that was weaker than I expected, but still recognizably that of a child who was accustomed to asking questions, "Is this the grandfather you told me about?" Sarah nodded and introduced me as her father, explaining that we hadn't seen each other for a long time because of complicated adult problems that had nothing to do with him. Standing beside my grandson's hospital bed, trying to make conversation with a child who was fighting for his life while connected to machines I didn't understand, I felt the full weight of 11 lost years pressing down on me like a physical burden. Michael asked me simple questions about where I lived and what kind of work I did, and I found myself editing my answers carefully, uncertain whether mentioning the Kingdom Hall or my role as an elder would create confusion or conflict in this already difficult situation. Over the following weeks, I began visiting the hospital regularly, telling the other elders that I was dealing with a family medical emergency without providing specific details about my contact with Sarah and Michael. The organization's literature had always been somewhat vague about emergency situations involving disfellowshipped family members, suggesting that each case should be handled individually based on the specific circumstances involved. I convinced myself that visiting a dying grandchild fell into some kind of acceptable exception category. Michael's treatment required him to remain hospitalized for extended periods, and during my visits, I began to learn about the remarkable child that my grandson had become, despite growing up without any connection to his paternal grandparents. He was fascinated by astronomy and had memorized the names of dozens of constellations and planets. He loved reading books about science and history, and he had an impressive collection of fossils and rocks that he had gathered during family camping trips to various state parks throughout Tennessee and Kentucky. Sarah would often step out of the room during my visits, giving Michael and me opportunities to talk privately, and I gradually began to understand the magnitude of what I had missed during his 11 years of life. He told me about learning to ride a bicycle in the parking lot of their apartment complex, about his first day of school and his favorite teachers, about the treehouse that David had built for him in their backyard, and about his plans to become either an astronaut or a paleontologist when he grew up. Each conversation with Michael revealed new layers of the intelligent, curious, and genuinely kind person he was becoming, and each revelation made my guilt heavier and more unbearable. This child had spent 11 years wondering about the grandparents who never called on his birthday, never sent Christmas cards, never showed up at his school plays or soccer games. According to Sarah, he had created elaborate fantasy stories about why we weren't part of his life, often imagining that we were secret agents or explorers who were traveling the world on important missions. The medical team was cautiously optimistic about Michael's response to treatment during the first month, and there were days when his energy levels returned almost to normal, and he would entertain the entire nursing staff with jokes and magic tricks that David had taught him. But in December 2013, Dr. Williams called another family meeting to explain that the leukemia had not responded to the initial treatment protocol as well as they had hoped, and that more aggressive chemotherapy would be necessary. Watching my grandson endure procedures that left him weak and nauseous, while maintaining his curiosity about the world and his concern for other sick children in the ward, was both inspiring and heartbreaking. He never complained about his illness or asked the "why me" questions that would have been perfectly understandable for a child in his situation. Instead, he spent his energy learning about his medical condition, asking doctors and nurses detailed questions about how chemotherapy worked and why cancer cells behave differently from healthy cells. During one of my visits in January 2014, Michael asked me directly about the religious differences that Sarah had mentioned as the reason for our long separation. "Grandpa Robert," he said with the straightforward honesty that children use when they want real answers to difficult questions, "Mom said you and Grandma Margaret belong to a church that doesn't allow you to talk to people who leave the church. Does that mean you think God doesn't want you to love me?" His question cut through all the theological justifications and organizational explanations I had been using to rationalize our family situation for more than a decade. How could I explain to an 11-year-old boy dying of cancer that I had spent his entire life believing that God required me to treat his mother as if she were dead, and that by extension I had never been allowed to acknowledge his existence? How could I make him understand that I had chosen loyalty to an organization over love for my own family? Instead of giving him the complex answer that might have been technically accurate according to Watchtower doctrine, I simply told him that sometimes adults make mistakes about what God wants, and that I was beginning to understand that love was more important than rules. Michael nodded seriously and said that he hoped I would figure out how to fix the mistake before it was too late, because he really wanted to meet his grandmother and hear stories about what his mother was like when she was little. That conversation with Michael was the moment when the foundation of everything I had believed for more than 40 years began to crack in ways that couldn't be repaired. If God was really directing the Watchtower organization, why would his guidance result in situations where faithful grandparents were forbidden from comforting their dying grandchildren? What kind of divine love would require such cruelty in the name of spiritual purity? In February 2014, Michael's condition took a turn for the worse, despite the aggressive treatment, and the medical team began preparing the family for the possibility that the leukemia might not be curable with current treatment. Options. Sarah remained strong during the daytime, advocating for her son and asking informed questions about experimental treatments and clinical trials. But I could see the toll that months of hope and disappointment were taking on her physical and emotional health. Margaret had been asking careful questions about my frequent absences from congregation meetings, and I finally told her the truth about Michael's illness and my hospital visits. Instead of being angry about my violation of the shunning arrangement, she broke down completely and begged me to take her to meet her grandson before it was too late. We drove to the hospital together the next day, and Margaret's first sight of Michael left her sobbing with a mixture of joy and grief that was painful to witness. Michael's reaction to meeting his grandmother was everything I had hoped it would be, and more devastating than I had anticipated. Despite his weakness from the latest round of chemotherapy, his face lit up with excitement, and he spent the entire visit asking Margaret questions about her childhood, about family recipes she might teach him someday, and about whether she had pictures of his mother when she was young. Margaret promised to bring photo albums during her next visit, not knowing that there wouldn't be enough time. On March 15th, 2014, Dr. Williams called to tell us that Michael had been admitted to the intensive care unit and that his family should prepare for the end. Margaret and I rushed to the hospital, where we found Sarah and David maintaining a bedside vigil while Michael drifted in and out of consciousness. During his lucid moments, he talked about the stars and planets he wanted to visit someday, and he made Sarah promise to take good care of the rock collection he was leaving behind for other kids who might want to become geologists. Michael died peacefully on March 17, 2014, surrounded by the family who had loved him throughout his short life, and the grandparents who had loved him from a distance, but had only been allowed to know him during his final months. As I held his small hand and watched him take his last breath, I felt something inside me break permanently. Not just my heart, but my faith in the organization that had stolen 11 years of love and relationship from all of us. The funeral was held 3 days later at a non-denominational church that Sarah and David attended, and the service was a celebration of Michael's curiosity, kindness, and courage, rather than a somber religious ceremony focused on death and judgment. Children from his school read poems they had written about their friend who loved to look at stars, and his teachers shared stories about the joy and wonder he had brought to their classrooms, even while fighting his illness. The weeks following Michael's funeral were the darkest period of my entire life, darker even than the chaos and violence I had witnessed during my time in Vietnam. At least in war, the enemy was clearly defined and the battles had obvious purposes, even if those purposes seemed meaningless in retrospect. But the battle I was fighting now was against an organization that had shaped my identity for more than 40 years, and against a lifetime of beliefs that had suddenly revealed themselves to be hollow and destructive. Margaret and I stopped attending meetings at the Kingdom Hall almost immediately after the funeral, unable to sit through discussions about God's love and wisdom while our hearts were breaking from the unnecessary loss we had suffered. The other elders began calling and visiting, expressing concern about our spiritual condition and reminding us that grief could sometimes lead faithful Christians into temporary periods of doubt that required patient encouragement from the congregation. Elder Martinez came to our house on a Thursday evening in early April, carrying his Bible and a stack of Watchtower publications that he believed would help restore our faith and perspective. "Brother Thompson," he said with the kind of patronizing sympathy that I had probably used myself when counseling other grieving families, "Satan often uses times of sorrow to plant seeds of bitterness against Jehovah's organization. We need to remember that God's ways are higher than our ways, and that the resurrection hope should comfort us during these difficult times." For the first time in decades, I found myself responding to organizational platitudes with anger instead of acceptance. "Brother Martinez," I said, standing up from my chair and looking directly into his eyes, "my grandson died without knowing his grandparents because this organization taught us that shunning our own daughter was more important than loving our family. Can you explain to me how that policy reflects God's love or wisdom?" The conversation that followed revealed the complete inability of Watchtower doctrine to address the real human consequences of its policies with anything more substantial than circular reasoning and appeals to organizational authority. Elder Martinez repeated the standard explanations about spiritual purity and the need to trust the faithful and discreet slave class. But every answer sounded increasingly hollow when measured against the reality of what our family had experienced. When I asked him directly whether he believed that God would want grandparents to shun their dying grandchildren, Martinez became defensive and began quoting scripture about not being wise in our own eyes and trusting in Jehovah with all our hearts. But when I asked him to show me specific biblical passages that commanded Christians to refuse contact with family members who left their religious organization, he was unable to provide anything more convincing than the organization's interpretations of verses that seemed to be addressing entirely different situations. After Elder Martinez left that evening, Margaret and I sat at our kitchen table and had the most honest conversation about our faith that we had shared in more than 20 years of marriage. We began examining the beliefs and practices that had governed our entire adult lives, asking questions that we had never been allowed to ask within the organizational structure of the Watchtower Society. I started researching the history of Jehovah's Witnesses using resources that had been forbidden during my years as an elder. And what I discovered was shocking in ways I had never anticipated. The organization's track record of failed prophecies was far more extensive than I had realized, with specific dates for Armageddon being predicted and then quietly abandoned multiple times throughout the 20th century. The 1975 debacle that I had lived through personally was just one example of a pattern of false predictions that stretched back to the organization's founding. Even more disturbing was learning about the systematic cover-up of child sexual abuse within congregations around the world, including policies that protected perpetrators and silenced victims in ways that were remarkably similar to what Sarah had experienced when she tried to speak out about other injustices within our local congregation. The organization's two-witness rule, which required corroborating testimony before action could be taken against accused elders or ministerial servants, had resulted in hundreds of cases where known predators were allowed to continue serving in positions of authority. Margaret discovered online support groups for former Jehovah's Witnesses, and through these connections, we learned that our experience of losing family relationships due to the shunning policy was tragically common. Thousands of parents, grandparents, children, and siblings had been separated for years or decades because of organizational rules that prioritized institutional loyalty over natural family bonds. Reading the stories of other families who had been torn apart by Watchtower policies, I began to understand that Michael's death was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a much larger pattern of suffering that the organization created through its authoritarian control over personal relationships. Children had died without knowing their grandparents, parents had missed weddings and graduations and births, and elderly people had died alone because their religious organization had convinced their families that association with former members was spiritually dangerous. In July 2014, 4 months after Michael's death, I made the decision to resign from my position as an elder and to formally disassociate myself from the Watchtower organization. The letter I wrote to the Kingdom Hall was brief and direct. I could no longer support an organization whose policies had prevented me from having a relationship with my grandson during his short life, and I no longer believed that the Watchtower Society was God's exclusive channel of communication with humanity. The response from the congregation was swift and predictable. Within a week of submitting my disassociation letter, Margaret and I were completely cut off from every friend and acquaintance we had made during our 43 years as Jehovah's Witnesses. People who had shared meals at our table, who had worked beside us in congregation activities, who had claimed to love us as spiritual family, now crossed the street to avoid acknowledging our existence. The irony was not lost on me that I was now experiencing the same treatment that I had inflicted on my own daughter for more than a decade. The isolation and rejection that felt so cruel and unnatural when applied to me was exactly what I had convinced myself was loving and necessary when applied to Sarah. The organizational machine that had separated me from my grandson was now separating former friends and fellow elders from me, and the cycle of institutional cruelty continued unbroken. Sarah was remarkably gracious during the process of rebuilding our relationship, showing none of the bitterness or resentment that would have been completely justified given what she had endured. Instead of demanding apologies or explanations, she simply welcomed Margaret and me back into her life, as if the lost years were water under the bridge, and the only thing that mattered was moving forward together. We began spending holidays together for the first time since Sarah's childhood, celebrating Christmas and birthdays and other occasions that had been forbidden during our years in the organization. Margaret learned to cook David's favorite meals, and I discovered that my son-in-law was a thoughtful and intelligent man who had loved my daughter well during the years when I had been absent from her life. But the joy of rebuilding our family relationships was always shadowed by grief for the grandson we would never recover. Sarah would show us photo albums documenting Michael's childhood, First steps, birthday parties, school concerts, camping trips, science fair projects, and each picture was a reminder of moments that we had missed forever because of organizational policies that had seemed so important at the time. In 2015, I began speaking publicly about the destructive effects of the Watchtower Society's shunning policy, sharing Michael's story at conferences and support group meetings for former Jehovah's Witnesses. The response was overwhelming, with hundreds of people reaching out to share their own experiences of family separation and loss caused by organizational rules that prioritized institutional loyalty over human love. Working with other former elders and longtime members, I helped establish a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting families who had been divided by high-control religious groups. We provided counseling services, legal assistance for custody disputes involving shunning practices, and educational resources to help people understand the psychological manipulation techniques used by authoritarian religious organizations. The most rewarding aspect of this work has been connecting with young people who are questioning their involvement in controlling religious groups before they reach the point of losing decades of their lives to organizational demands. Many of these individuals are the same age that Sarah was when she began asking difficult questions about Watchtower teachings, and I hope that sharing my story helps them make informed decisions about their futures without the pressure and fear that characterized my own experience. Margaret and I have now been out of the Watchtower organization for more than 10 years, and we have rebuilt our lives around genuine relationships with people who value authenticity over conformity. We attend a small community church where questions are welcomed rather than discouraged, and where the emphasis is on loving service to others rather than adherence to complex doctrinal requirements. Sarah has thrived in ways that might not have been possible if she had remained within the restrictive environment of the Watchtower organization. She completed advanced training in pediatric oncology nursing and now works as a patient advocate, helping families navigate the medical and emotional challenges of childhood cancer. Her work is a living memorial to Michael's memory, ensuring that other children receive the kind of compassionate care that made such a difference during his final months. David has become the son I never had, and our relationship has grown into one of mutual respect and genuine friendship despite the years we lost to organizational interference. He has never expressed anger about the way Margaret and I treated his family during Michael's early years, choosing instead to focus on the positive changes we have made and the love we share now. But late at night, when the house is quiet and my mind wanders back to the choices I made during those lost years, I still struggle with guilt and regret that feel almost unbearable. Michael would be 21 years old now if he had survived his illness, probably finishing college and starting his own adult life. I imagine him as a young man with his mother's intelligence and his grandfather's determination, perhaps working in some field related to his childhood fascination with science and discovery. The most painful aspect of my story is not just the time I lost with Michael, but the time he lost with us. He died wondering about grandparents who loved him, but were forbidden from showing that love, creating fantasies about our absence that were more generous than the reality of our choice to prioritize organizational approval over family relationships. My dear friends who have listened to this old man's confession, I want to leave you with the most important lesson I learned from the worst mistake of my life. No religious organization, no matter how sincerely it claims to represent God, has the right to destroy the natural bonds of love that exist between family members. Any group that demands you choose between their approval and your love for your children, parents, siblings, or grandchildren is not serving God, but serving its own institutional interests. If you are currently involved in a religious organization that practices shunning or that discourages questions and independent thinking, please consider whether the price of membership is worth the human cost. And if you are a parent or grandparent who has been separated from family members because of religious differences, please know that love is stronger than doctrine and that it is never too late to choose your family over your religious organization. Thank you for allowing me to share Michael's story and my own. His brief life had more meaning and impact than many people achieve in decades, and I hope that telling our story might prevent other families from experiencing the unnecessary grief that comes from putting religious rules ahead of human love. Michael taught me that the most important truth is not found in any religious publication, but in the simple act of loving the people God has placed in our lives while we still have the chance.